Turn number 570, we'll sing this song, 570. I got the word up here.
He made that.
Each day until a golden king, my coming home to glory live. My life on earth is but a sand, and so I'll do the best I can. My sinking sun is sinking low, is sinking low. I must go to meet the King that I have done. But there will be no setting sun to be the child of God each day. My light will shine all the way. I'll sing His praise all ages long. And time to have some troubled soul. My evening sun is sinking low, is sinking low. A few more days, and I must go to meet the King that I have done. But there will be no setting sun. While going down my steering road, I'll try to live some travelers low. I'll try to turn the night to day, with flowers burn along the way. My evening sun is sinking low, is sinking low. A few more days, and I must go to meet the King that I have done. But there will be no setting sun.
Good evening. I'd like to welcome each and every one of you here to the worship services of Week Off. It's good to be back in town in the midst of our church family. I think this is the longest I've ever been gone, except when I went to Georgia for training, first went to work. But anyway, we got a few announcements tonight. Of course, we want to silence the mobile devices before we start. On our prayer list, of course, we've all heard about Susan Hull, who's lived here all her life before she moved off, superintendent of Grand Prairie School District. She did have a massive stroke that looked like control of motorcycle. Subsequently was killed. And the funeral for her will be 3 o'clock at the New Boston High School auditorium. Visitation starts at 12:30 at the Methodist Church. They're going to have that first, and then it goes on to 2 o'clock. And they'll have a funeral like 3 o'clock at the high school auditorium. I spoke to one of her daughters today. They're all 3 lost and heartbroken. That's all I can say. Please keep them in your prayers. Those kids are hurting really bad. They were real close with their mother. Summer Youth Series next week is in Logic. The band will leave here at 6 p.m. on Monday. Singing on the 12th at the Oak Grove in Mount Pleasant. The 12th is Friday, okay. And that is from 7 to 8:30 p.m. We'll also take the band at this event, and we will leave at 6 p.m. on Friday for that. Is there anything else that we need to bring up?
I didn't get a chance to write it down, but James told me Brother Weaver is looking a lot better. And he's doing so much better, he'll be able to leave the end
we come to you tonight with heavy hearts, praying that your healing hand will be on these three children that's lost their mother. Help them in the upcoming days. Comfort them, which we know you can. Them to understand. Be with them and guide them. Give them all your love and care, as I said, with your loving hand. Watch over them. Thank you for the rain. Thank you for the many things that you give us, and help us to take what we learn tonight and apply it to our everyday lives. And be with Kevin that he can convey everything that he intends to us for our instruction. Give us our many sins. In Christ's name we pray.
The invitation song is song number 594. 594 for the invitation song. We're looking at the book of Job on Wednesday nights in our adult Bible class, and in we're in Job chapters 15 through 17, looking at this fourth dialogue between Eliphaz and Job. And we see Eliphaz once again accuse Job of committing some kind of sin, which of course Job has not committed. And in Job's response to Eliphaz, in Job chapter 16 and verse 5, he makes this statement: "But I would strengthen you with my mouth, and the comfort of my lips would relieve your grief." And one of the great messages of the book of Job is how we work with people who are suffering. And Job is the one who's suffering, and yet he's the one who's giving the correct advice regarding how to treat people who are grieving. Grieving people experience a lot of emotions. Grieving people express themselves in a lot of contradictory ways, many of which aren't supposed to be rational. They're just supposed to allow the grieving person to express his thoughts and his feelings without judgment, so that he can get those thoughts and feelings out there and process his grief. But what Eliphaz is doing instead is treating Job as if he's not grieving and not going through suffering and not having a difficult time in life, and treating him as if he just needs to act regularly like normal. But of course, that's not how grieving people and suffering people think or act. But one thing that we can say about Job is that he gives pretty good advice. And in this particular verse, he gives some good advice. "I would strengthen you with my mouth, and the moving of my lips should assuage your grief." In other words, when we encounter people who are suffering, what we ought to, if we're going to say anything at all, what we need to say is words of comfort. Words that are designed to help. Words that are designed to alleviate the burden, as opposed to just add to it, which in essence is what Job's friends have done. Well, as we think about these things tonight, we can make practical application of this by thinking about those friends around us who are grieving and who are suffering. And when we talk to them, remember the words of Job. Let's seek to be those who are adding to people's help as opposed to taking away from it. Let's be those who are going to strengthen others, build them up, and encourage them, as opposed to taking them down and contradicting and hurting them emotionally when they're having difficult times. Let's be those who are going to assuage grief instead of make it more complicated. And so as we think about those things, and we think about our relationship with God, we remember that Jesus was a person who comforted others. He was one who had compassion. He was one who reached out to those who were in times of grief and pain and suffering and helped them as opposed to complicating their situation. I remember in John chapter 11, I believe it is, when Lazarus had died, Jesus went to the place where they were at. There with them, He held their hands and wept. What a great Bible verse to remind us that Jesus Himself felt the needs of even those who are grieving. We put our trust and our faith in Jesus because He knows what it's like to truly be a human being as God intended for a human being to be. And He sets the standard for us. He is the model for our behavior. And He wants us to follow Him and to do His will. If we have seen the comfort of the Lord in the life of Jesus Christ, then we should listen to His words of exhortation when He tells us what we need to do to become a child of God and to live with God forever in eternity. Hear His words and believe them, repent of our sins, confess Him as Lord, and be baptized for the forgiveness of sins. Maybe there's someone here tonight who would like to do that. Maybe you need the prayers of the church for times of comfort for you because you're grieving or mourning or going through suffering of one kind or another. We're ready to offer those prayers. Whatever your need may be, now is an opportunity for you to make that known. And come now while we stand and sing.
Jesus, oh my brother, His disciple ever be. Render not to any other what alone the Lord should be. Live for Jesus, give Him all thou hast to give. On the cross the world's Redeemer gave His life that thou mightst live. Live for Jesus in life's morning, at the noontide hour He gives, and at eve when day is turning, and in heaven endless bliss. Live for Jesus, give Him all thou hast to give. On the cross the world's Redeemer gave His life that thou mightst live.
Heavenly Father, we ask that you be with each one here tonight. We ask that you dismiss us from this auditorium and go to our classes. We ask that you be with the teachers and presenters of the lessons tonight, that you give them a ready recollection of those things prepared. Be with us as listeners and let us be attentive and be mindful of the subject. Be sure that we take these things in the Father's of our lives. We ask that you be with the ones on the city list, the ones that's bereaved. You know what's gone through the service, through the further walks of life, and just our sins in Christ's name. Should have mowed this street.
Does anybody need Job 15 or 16? Job 15 or 17? All right. this one out last week, so here you go. Anybody else? Y'all good? Everybody good? Has anybody ever heard the term active emotional coping?
No.
Does that mean anything to anybody?
Coping?
Coping. C-O-P-I-N-G. Coping. Active emotional coping. I've been reading a book on grief and grieving, a psychology book, and I got to a section where the author was talking about coping skills, different coping skills for how people cope with loss and how the different things that they do. And the author was saying that those who practice active emotional coping are process grief much better than those who do not. And there's normal grieving, and then there's what they call complicated grieving. Complicated grieving is when you have grief that just goes on and on and on. It never seems to resolve. Normal grieving eventually resolves, but complicated grieving does not. So active emotional coping is a mechanism that leads to resolution of grief. And in essence, what the active emotional cope person does who copes with their grief is they're able to take their loss, whatever it might be, redefine it, reframe it, and accept support for it so that they are then able to move forward in life functionally. And they also, active emotional coping is also very, it's just like it sounds, it's active. It's not passive. People who practice passive emotional coping are more likely to end up in a complicated grieving situation as opposed to a normal grieving situation. Now, grief is difficult regardless of what kind of situation you end up in. But the reason I'm bringing this up is because as we're reading through the book of Job, I noticed this and I thought, you know what Job is doing here is practicing active emotional coping. All right? He's talking about his problems. He's talking about his suffering. He's talking about his situation. And that's important for a person who is grieving. Grieving people need to be able to express themselves while they're grieving without having others judge and without having others interrupt and cause additional issues. But, Job's situation isn't normal because his friends are adding on top of his grief by accusing him of this horrible sin that he's committed, allegedly. So, but I just thought that was interesting. I wanted to share that with you, that here in the Bible, centuries, millennia ago, we find a grieving person practicing what modern psychology says is the right way to approach grief. And I think that's interesting to note that. Of course, it shouldn't be a surprise to us who believe the Bible because we know the Bible is inspired of God and everything that God inspires is there for our benefit and our help. And so as you see Job processing his emotions and interacting with his friends, you're going to see how a person is able to grieve in a proper way as he moves through this process. And at the end of the book of Job, God comes down and talks to Job, and active emotional coping is we talk about what we're grieving about. We talk about the pain, the suffering. We say it however we want to say it. It doesn't matter. And then we allow that process to help us to redefine and reframe the loss in terms that we can then live with in a functional way going forward. But also involved in this active emotional coping is accepting support. And of course, you've got to accept support to even talk to somebody. But as we get to the end of the book of Job, when God speaks to Job, Job accepts God's support. Even though God has some questions for Job that Job can't answer, ultimately, Job accepts God's support because he knows who God is, and he knows that he doesn't. That's where he's put his faith and his trust is in the Lord. And that's one of the points we're going to notice tonight. And that really, and I was thinking about this earlier, that's really the primary difference between Job and between his friends. Okay? As the friends go through and make their arguments against Job, they will cite things like, they will say, well, a still small, or a spirit told me in the night. That's the first thing that Eliphaz says, a vision. He had a vision. They will cite things like the ancients believe this, and the elders believe this. And then here in Eliphaz's last argument in chapter 15, he talks about how it's the older who believe this. But all of those sources of information are not God. All right? And that's the point. That Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar put their faith and trust in things other than God. Now they believe that they are defending God. They believe that they're doing God's will by saying the things that they're saying. But when they go to cite evidence for what they believe, they don't say God said this. They say the ancients said this, or the Spirit told me this, or the older people say this. They cite all kinds of different sources except God. And the one thing that Job does over and over again is put his faith and trust in God. And he says repeatedly that he would speak with God, and God would be his redeemer. And that God, though he slay me, yet will I trust him, is Job's statement. And so Job never gives up on God. And he never gives up on God coming to redeem him from this situation. Ultimately, God does redeem him, though God does not acquiesce to Job's request to explain what was going on and why God allowed this to happen. God does not do that. He never explains to Job, at least in this series of dialogues. Now, assuming that the book of Job was written by Job sometime later, ultimately Job would then get the explanation as God was inspiring him to write the book. But in light of the fact that that's not going on in the dialogues, God never does give an explanation to Job in the context of his suffering. All right? He never tells Job why these things are happening while he's suffering or while he's grieving or anything. So anyway, I just thought that was an interesting little point to make about active emotional coping. And that's a very successful coping technique that is used to process grief and to have a normal grieving experience. And that seems to be what Job is trying to do here. And that's one of the reasons why it's right for him to complain about his situation and his circumstance. And that the friends are trying to shut him down. They're trying to say, Job, you just need to stop talking, and you need to confess sin and move on and just let whatever happens happen, but just stop. But Job's not stopping. And that's the right thing to do for Job not to stop. That is, for him to keep talking about this is the right thing to do if he's going to process his suffering and his grief appropriately. All right? So anyway, I just wanted to pass that on. Anybody have any questions or comments about that, or any thoughts that you'd like to share? All right, well, last week we got into Job chapter 15, and I believe we got through verse 16. And if you recall, Eliphaz was affirming the impossibility of Job being innocent, but by virtue of his just being a human being, and more or less. And verses 14 through 16, what is man that he could be pure, and he who is born of woman that he could be righteous? If God puts no trust in his saints, and the heavens are not pure in his sight, how much less man, who is abominable and filthy, who drinks iniquity like water. I would like to point out, though, that Eliphaz is wrong in his assessment here. First of all, God does put trust in his saints. He has, Paul tells us in the New Testament, he's entrusted us with the gospel. And so it's not true what Eliphaz is arguing for here, that God doesn't trust his saints. It says the heavens are not pure in his sight. And that's not true either. Certainly the heavens are what God made them to be, and they're pure in the sense that it's where God lives and where he dwells. Then he says, how much less man who is abominable and filthy, who drinks iniquity like water. Well, we know from the beginning of the book of Job that Job doesn't fall into this category. That, sure, there's a lot of men, a lot of people who are abominable and filthy and who drink iniquity like water. There's a lot of them. But not everybody lives like that. Job did not live like that. And there's others who don't live like that either. Eliphaz is guilty of making a mental error here. And the mental error that he makes is overgeneralization. It's the idea that, well, if it's true for one, it must be true for everyone. And that's just not the case. So his arguments are not right at this point. Verses 17 and following, he basically affirms or reaffirms that bad things only happen to bad people. So let's read these verses together. I will tell you, hear me, what I have seen I will declare. What wise men have told, not hiding anything received from their fathers, to whom alone the land was given, and no alien passed among them. The wicked man writhes with pain all his days, and the number of years is hidden from the oppressor. Dreadful sounds are in his ears. In prosperity, the destroyer comes upon him. He does not believe that he will return from darkness, for sword is waiting for him. He wanders about for bread, saying, where is it? He knows that a day of darkness is ready at his hand. Trouble and anguish make him afraid. They overpower him like a king ready for battle. For he stretches out his hand against God and acts defiantly against the Almighty, running stubbornly against him with his strong and bossed shield. Of course, all these words are directed toward Job. And in essence, what Eliphaz is saying is that, Job, you're this person. So we shouldn't pretend that Eliphaz is just sort of speaking generically and not trying to apply this to anyone. He is trying to apply this to Job. Verse 27, though he has covered his face with fatness and made his waist heavy with fat, he dwells in desolate cities and houses which no one inhabits, which are destined to become ruined. By the way, being fat was a sign of prosperity, and so that's what he's talking about. Is even though the wicked may seem prosperous, they're really desolate, is what he's arguing here, verse 28. In houses which no inhabits, which are destined to become ruins, he will not be rich, nor will his wealth continue, nor will his possessions overspread the earth. He will not depart from darkness. The flame will dry out his branches, and by the breath of his mouth he will go away. Let him not trust in futile things, deceiving himself, for futility will be his reward. It will be accomplished before his time, and his branch will not be green. He will shake off his unripe grape like a vine, and cast off his blossom like an olive tree. In other words, he may look like he's going to prosper, but then before everything comes to complete fruition, he loses it, and it all goes away, is the imagery there. For the company of hypocrites will be barren, and fire will consume the tents of bribery. They conceive trouble and bring forth futility. Their womb prepares deceit. All right. So, same argument that he's made previously. Now, Job is going to eventually respond to these arguments in a later dialogue and point out that, in fact, what they're saying is just flat out false. There's plenty of people in the world who, at least physically, prosper and seem to do well and seem to be happy, and they die and it looks like everything's just fine, you know. So what he's saying is that experience contradicts the doctrine that Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar are teaching. So their doctrine, again, just to review, is that for every misdeed or sin that one does in this life, there is some corresponding suffering that goes along with it in a one-to-one type relationship. And so since Job is just suffering tremendously, he must have some big sin that he's hiding and not confessing to anyone, is what they're trying to say. All right, any questions or comments? Well, let's look at chapter 16 then. Job chapter 16. Then Job answered and said, I have heard many such things. Miserable comforters are you all. You know, he just lays into them again and calls it like it is, saying, you guys are terrible comforters. You're not helping me at all. You're supposed to be here to support me, to help me, to give me some relief from all of this suffering I'm going through, and you're just adding to my problems. So Job has even though he's suffering and grieving, he has a very astute idea of what's going on here. Verse 3, shall words of wind have an end? Or what provokes you that you answer? I also could speak as you do. If your soul were in my soul's place, I could heap up words against you and shake my head at you. In other words, Job said, well, if you were in my shoes, I could do the same thing that you do to me. But then he says this, but I would strengthen you with my mouth, and the comfort of my lips would relieve your grief. In other words, what Job is saying is that if I were in your shoes and you were in mine, I wouldn't act this way toward you. I wouldn't behave like this. This is a horrible way for you guys to behave, basically. So he's basically trying to convince them that the way they're acting is wrong right now. But they're not going to listen to Job because they're filled with their own self-righteousness, right? Their own belief system. And it can't be contradicted because contradicting their belief system is an affront to their pride, and it is an affront to their identity. They've placed their pride and their identity in this false belief system that they have, and to give it up would be to admit that they're not the person that they think they are. Okay? And that's hard for people to do. It's hard for people to say, I'm not really who I think I am. I'm somebody else. But that's sort of how self-righteousness works. It kind of builds that pride within a person. All right, verse 6, Job's continuing to speak. He says, and by the way, verses 1 through 5, Job says he would accuse them if he was in their place. At 6 through 14, Job adds his friends' quote-unquote comforts to the list of his sufferings. But he still attributes his sufferings to God. So let's look at verses 6 through 14 then, of chapter 16. Though I speak, my grief is not relieved. And if I remain silent, how am I eased? But now he has worn me out. You have made desolate all my company. You have shriveled me up. And it is a witness against me. My leanness rises up against me and bears witness to my face. He tears me in his wrath and hates me. He gnashes at me with his teeth. My adversary sharpens his gaze on me. They gape at me with their mouth. They strike me reproachfully on the cheek. They gather together against me. God has delivered me to the ungodly and turned me over to the hands of the wicked. I was at ease, but he has shattered me. He also has taken me by my neck and shaken me to pieces. He has set me up for his target. His archers surround me. He pierces my heart and does not pity. He pours out my gall on the ground. He breaks me with wound upon wound. He runs at me like a warrior. This is a picture of a battle, if you will. And what Job is saying is that God is treating him like he's his enemy, and that he's thrusting him through, with a spear and shooting him with arrows over and over again. It's a very disturbing picture, of a battle scene where a person is just being torn up by the enemy. Gall, when he talks about gall coming out on the ground, the gall doesn't come out unless you've had a spear or a sword shoved into your body. And that is then, gall is what's made by the gallbladder. It's green looking, so that's how they identified it. But so of course this is metaphorical language that Job is using to describe what he believes to be God's persecution of him or attack on him or something like that. And he believes that God is the one who is responsible for continuing to do these things to him. So, again, he describes it in some pretty colorful language.
Now, this is somewhat confusing to me.
Okay.
Let me tell you why.
All right.
He's not bit. Well, maybe I shouldn't say it. All the time we've been studying this, and I know I haven't been here for one, but he's not bitter. At the first, he was not bitter towards God or disliked God or had ill will. Now it seems with all this metaphoric explanation, it seems like he's starting to really get like, he's explaining this situation like a sea monster's after him.
Yeah, his tone gets increasingly more accusatory toward God.
There you go.
As the book rolls along, and when Job finally speaks his last words, he does point an accusatory finger at God and blame God, and then expect God to do something about it. All right, and he does. We'll talk about that when we get there. It's a little bit further on in the book, but he makes some pretty strong statements.
This is building up to where you just about had enough.
Yeah, it is. It's building up. And so anyway, but he's definitely talking about his friends too. They're part of the situation that's causing him to suffer. God delivered me to the ungodly. Well, that's his friends. They're the ungodly who are continuing to reproach him and speak evil against him and things like that. So he does feel like their words are continuing to add to his grief and to his suffering, and that God is also responsible for that, in the sense that they're trying to do God's will, I guess. I don't know, but that seems to be what Job is saying. And again, this is a grieving person, this is a suffering person speaking, and grieving people and suffering people sometimes say things that are difficult to process. But that's how Job is talking here. Any other comments or thoughts? But even though Michael, he is sort of taking this approach toward God as his enemy, at the same time, his statement in the previous chapter, though he slay me, yet will I trust him, shows that even though Job thinks God is his enemy, he still has nowhere else to turn for someone to save him except for God. And so he continues to trust God, even though he thinks God has made him his enemy. So Job never gives up on trusting in God in the book.
He's just describing how bad this is. And it's really
and it also shows you that God will put up with a lot of things in us. Let's say put up with, in a sense, as long as we continue to put our faith and trust in him. All right? He continues to work with us and continue to help us, because we are sinful creatures and we do commit sin. But as long as we don't give up on God, God's not going to give up on us. But Job's friends have given up on God, and they just don't know it. That's the problem with them. They're not trusting in God at all. They're trusting in man, more or less. Any other thoughts?
When Job's in the situation, he's finite, and he's trying to comprehend, he's trying to understand what's going on with his suffering. And God is infinite, and knows very well, and he's doing this for a reason. Job doesn't know it all the time. We're finite also, but we have more than Job had.
A lot more, yes.
More than Job had, and we're still faced with conflict and suffering in times of grief.
Right.
We're still faced with obviously finite, not understanding all of why things happen, but we understand some of why.
Okay. All right, well, let's look at verses 18 through 22. Job again calls upon God to witness to his innocence. 18 through 22. O earth, do not cover my blood, and let my cry have no resting place. Surely even now my witness is in heaven, and my evidence is on high. My friends scorn me. My eyes pour out tears to God. Oh, that one might plead for a man with God as a man pleads for his neighbor. For when a few years are finished, I shall go the way of no return. What a cry there in verse 21. Oh, that one might plead for a man with God as a man pleads for his neighbor. And one of the great things about the book of Job is that we can see how in the life of Jesus, these kind of pleas that Job makes are answered. And that God is really listening to Job, and that he does really understand Job's situation, and that God is ultimately going to provide for exactly what Job is asking for, which is some kind of mediator to stand between him and God, to express to God the sufferings that we go through, the trials we go through, the difficulties that we go through. And that's exactly what Jesus does. The book of Hebrews tells us that he ever lives to make intercession for us. That's the job that he wants to do. And so, while God doesn't answer Job in the book of Job, he certainly does provide an answer in his son Jesus and in the work that Jesus did on the cross, and that the work Jesus is doing right now as high priest for all Christians throughout all times. So what a wonderful expression and a wonderful answer the Bible gives to Job's pleas here. And you can kind of imagine, the Bible talks about people who were before the time of Christ not understanding what it was all about, and then when Jesus finally died on the cross and was raised from the grave and he went to sit at the right hand of the throne of God, the light bulb kind of goes off. And so I wonder, Job was a righteous man. There's no doubt that he's in paradise. What a wonderful blessing he would experience then, knowing that Christ has responded, or that God, through Christ, has responded to the very cries that he made while he was grieving and suffering. And that's a great comfort to us as well. Because when we're grieving and we're suffering, we can know that there's a mediator standing on our behalf, pleading to God for our case right now. Job did not have that comfort while he was in life, but at least he has it afterlife in paradise. And that is a tremendous thing. All right, chapter 17. Job continues his lament for his life in the face of faithless friends. 1 through 5. Job complains that his friends are no help. My spirit is broken, my days are extinguished, the grave is ready for me. Are not mockers with me, and does not my eye dwell on their provocation? Now put down a pledge for me with yourself. Who is he who will shake hands with me? For you have hidden their heart from understanding. Therefore you will not exalt them. He who speaks flattery to his friends, even the eyes of his children, will fail. So, again, Job is looking for someone to give him some assistance, some help, some comfort, but there's no one there who's doing that. And he again thinks that God is adding to his suffering through that as well. Verses 6 through 9, Job reflects that it is astonishing for an innocent man to be in his situation. Again, notice, he has made me as God. He's talking to God here. But he has made me a byword of the people, and I have become one in whose face men spit. My eye has also grown dim because of sorrow, and all my members are like shadows. Upright men are astonished at this, and the innocent stirs himself up against the hypocrite. Yet the righteous will hold to his way, and he who has clean hands will be stronger and stronger. And again, Job knows that he's righteous, that he has not done anything that's worthy of this kind of response from God. And so he proclaims his righteousness here in verse 9 and his clean hands here, that they will be stronger and stronger. And so he's not giving up on his innocence anytime soon. His friends' arguments are not having the effect that they desire it to have. Now, that's another thing about talking with people about sometimes just, without complicating it with grief and suffering, but just talking to people about religious matters, is that when we make heavy-handed and strong arguments, we may end up pushing people away instead of drawing them closer. There is a right time and place to talk to people about the hard truths that are presented in the Scriptures. But it's not always the case that you have to do that every time you see them. That's probably not going to accomplish what you want to accomplish in relationship to others. Sometimes you just want to sit back and listen to what somebody else says and what they believe, and let them express themselves and ask probing questions and ask them to clarify and try to understand what they're saying without contradicting at all. And then later, there will be an opportunity for you to present the other side of the issue in a less confrontational environment. And that is a better way of handling things than the way Job's friends are handling things, which are in essence just pushing Job further away from them. Their words are not persuading Job at all. Just the opposite, in essence, what Job is saying. He has clean hands and he's going to be stronger and stronger. In other words, he's moving away from them, not toward them. So, again, Job's words of advice when he says that they should strengthen him with their mouth and, relieve his grief, those things would be much more effective in relationship to someone who perhaps doesn't know the truth than trying to do it the way Job's friends are doing it here. Any questions or comments about that, or any additional thoughts that anyone would like to share? Verse 10 through 16, Job reasons that he will receive no justification in the grave. But please come back again, all of you, for I shall not find one wise man among you. And there may be a little sarcasm here that he's using. Verse 11, my days are past, my purposes are broken off. Even the thoughts of my heart, they change the night into day. The light is near, they say, in the face of darkness. If I wait for the grave as my house, if I make my bed in the darkness, if I say to corruption, you are my father, and to the worm, you are my mother and my sister, where then is my hope? As for my hope, who can see it? Will they go down to the gates of Sheol? Shall we have rest together in the dust? And again, Job is just expressing the sort of dismal outcome that he thinks is going to take place in his life very soon. All right. Any questions or comments?
Well, without the inspired word, we would have nothing of any benefit to say for any time of grief. Except for to say, we're here with you. And that would be some comfort to grief. But as far as eternity is concerned, as far as looking beyond the here and now, we have no way to take that part of God. So, it's a great benefit not just for ourselves, but then others who will contact and interact with in this life to make note of those things that are going to help us.
Any other thoughts? Let's just revisit Job 16 and verse 19 real quick. Again, there's another passage here where Job makes it very clear that he continues to trust in God even though he thinks God is his enemy and persecuting him and tormenting him in this way. But verse 19, he says, surely even now my witness is in heaven and my evidence is on high. And of course, he still believes that God is going to vindicate him in the face of his friend's accusation. And ultimately, God is going to vindicate him. When we get to Job chapter 40, at the end of the book, God tells Job's friends that they had not spoken the thing that is right concerning him, as Job has. And so ultimately God will vindicate Job, but and one of the reasons why God does it is Job continues to put his faith and trust in God, regardless of what he believes is happening. I mean, it sounds almost contradictory. It is contradictory, I guess, to think that God has made you his enemy, and yet you're still going to trust in him. And again, that's simply because Job has nowhere else to turn. I mean, who are you going to turn to besides God to help you when you're in trouble, when you're in great stress and difficulty and great pain and suffering and mourning? Who are you going to turn to? Well, God is the only one. He's the only one. And so Job just continues to put his faith and trust in God. I think it's a tremendous testimony to his faith that he's believing these things at a time before revelation that we have, and really allowing God to vindicate him when he has no reason to believe that God will, because of what he believes God will do. It's a tremendous lesson in faith. All right, well, we'll go ahead and stop there unless somebody else has a comment. Thank you so much. Stay dry. Cool.
No, we're waiting on the comment.